What if I told you that discovering your wife's affair could lead to the most satisfying revenge story you've ever heard? A story where justice wasn't just served cold, but completely destroyed the life of the man who thought he could break up a family without consequences. Stick around because this tale of betrayal, investigation, and ultimate revenge will leave you questioning everything you think you know about karma. My name is David, and I'm about to tell you the story of how my world fell apart and how I rebuilt it by destroying someone else's. This isn't just a story about cheating. It's about what happens when a methodical mind meets ultimate betrayal. This isn't your typical cheating spouse story. This is about how one man's methodical approach to uncovering the truth led to a domino effect that would destroy his wife's lover in ways that even Hollywood couldn't script. And the best part? It was all completely legal. Picture this: early 2000s, dial-up internet, AOL email addresses, and a time when privacy meant something entirely different than it does today. I was living what I thought was a normal life with my wife and our 2 young children, ages 4 and 6. Life seemed predictable, routine, even comfortable. But sometimes the most devastating betrayals hide behind the most ordinary facades. The first red flag wasn't dramatic. It wasn't lipstick on a collar or suspicious phone calls. It was something far more subtle, something that any parent would initially dismiss as normal family logistics. My children started talking about spending time with their grandparents during the day. Now, grandparents babysitting isn't unusual, right? Except these grandparents lived 90 minutes away, and according to my kids, they were visiting them 2 or 3 times a week. Think about that math for a moment. That's 3 hours of driving round trip multiple times per week just for babysitting. When my wife wasn't working her part-time job, she was apparently making this trek regularly with our children. As a father, as a husband, as someone who thought he knew his family's routine, this didn't add up. When I casually brought this up with my wife, asking about all these visits to her parents, her response was immediate denial. But here's the thing about liars, especially amateur ones. They have tells. My wife was never good at deception, and her nervous dismissal only amplified my suspicions rather than putting them to rest. Now, some people might have let this slide, convinced themselves they were being paranoid, maybe even felt guilty for questioning their spouse's activities. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. Call it intuition, call it paranoia, or call it the instinct of someone who refuses to be made a fool of. So I did what any suspicious husband in the early 2000s would do. I started tracking mileage. Not with GPS, not with smartphone apps, but with old-fashioned pen and paper, recording the odometer readings on my wife's car. The results were staggering. She was driving an extra 400 miles per week. 400 miles that couldn't be explained by her part-time job, grocery runs, or any of the normal activities of daily life. Let me put that in perspective for you. 400 extra miles per week meant she was either taking incredibly long routes to places she claimed to be going, or she was going somewhere she wasn't telling me about. Given that her parents lived 90 minutes away, the math suggested she was making that trip far more frequently than she was admitting, or there was another destination entirely. At this point, I knew something was happening, but I didn't know what. Suspicion without proof is torture, especially when it involves the person you've built your life with, the mother of your children. I needed more than mileage discrepancies and nervous denials. I needed concrete evidence. Then fate intervened in the most mundane way possible. I sat down at our shared computer one day, and there, stuck to the monitor like a beacon of truth, was a yellow sticky note with my wife's AOL email password written on it. She had left it there, probably after having trouble logging in, completely forgetting about it afterward. Now I want to pause here and acknowledge something important. What I was about to do crossed a line. Reading someone else's private emails, even your spouse's, is a violation of privacy and trust. But when you suspect your marriage is built on lies, when you believe your family is being destroyed by deception, sometimes you make choices that you wouldn't normally make. Sometimes you decide that discovering the truth is worth crossing ethical boundaries. I logged into her email account, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. What I found there would change everything. Among the typical emails, forwards from friends, spam, work-related messages, were exchanges between my wife and her college best friend. Intimate conversations between 2 women who trusted each other completely. never imagining that a betrayed husband would be reading their words. The emails revealed everything. My wife was having an affair with one of her ex-boyfriends from high school. These weren't just emotional exchanges or reminiscing about the past. These were detailed discussions about ongoing sexual encounters, logistics of when and where they would meet, and the elaborate deception required to maintain the affair. But what struck me most wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was the callousness of it all. In these emails, my wife and her friend were mocking this man's wife, making cruel jokes about how she had gotten fat after having children. They were laughing at the pain they were causing, treating adultery like it was some kind of entertaining game rather than the destruction of two families. I printed those emails immediately, every single one of them. Not because I was planning immediate confrontation, but because I understood that evidence disappears, people delete things, and if I was going to act on this information, I needed permanent proof of what I had discovered. But even with these emails, I still didn't have the complete picture. I knew who was involved and that it was happening, but I didn't know the specifics. Where, when, how often, what the full scope of this deception looked like. I needed professional help. I called a friend who worked as a police officer, not to report a crime, but to ask for advice. He listened to my situation and recommended someone he knew, a former cop who had left the force to become a private investigator. Ron, he said, was discreet, thorough, and exactly what I needed. Meeting Ron was like stepping into a detective novel. He was professional, understanding, and completely non-judgmental about my situation. I paid his retainer, handed over the printed emails, and explained everything I had discovered so far. His response was simple. Give me 2 weeks and I'll give you the whole story. While Ron was conducting his investigation, I was living in a strange limbo. I was still going through the motions of normal married life, still being a father to my children, still pretending that I didn't know what I knew. It was psychological torture, but I understood that premature action could ruin everything. I needed the complete truth before I could decide how to proceed. 2 weeks later, Ron delivered a report that was both professionally thorough and personally devastating. He had photos, timestamps, locations, and a complete timeline of my wife's affair. The pattern was exactly what I had suspected, but seeing it documented in such detail was still shocking. According to Ron's investigation, my wife would drive the children to her parents' house ostensibly for babysitting, but instead of staying there or running errands, she would meet her high school ex-boyfriend for lunch at various restaurants. After lunch, they would go to the same cheap motel, spend several hours together, and then she would return to pick up the children and drive home to me. The methodical nature of it was what hurt the most. This wasn't a spontaneous affair or a moment of weakness. This was a calculated, ongoing deception that required planning, lies, and the manipulation of our children as unwitting alibis. She was using our kids as cover for her betrayal. Ron's report also included background information on the other man involved. His name was Bob. He was married with 3 children of his own, and he worked as a vice president of sales for his father-in-law's business. This detail would prove crucial later, though I didn't fully appreciate its significance at the time. At this point, I had to make some serious decisions about my future. My parents had cheated on each other during my childhood, and the aftermath had absolutely destroyed our family dynamic. I had lived through the consequences of infidelity from a child's perspective, and I was determined that my own children wouldn't suffer the same fate if I could prevent it. I hired a divorce lawyer immediately. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted revenge, but because I believed that a marriage built on fundamental deception couldn't be salvaged. Some people might choose counseling, might try to work through infidelity, but for me, this level of betrayal was unforgivable. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. While I was preparing for my own divorce, I kept thinking about Bob's wife. She was living the same lie I had been living, trusting someone who was betraying her, raising children with a man who was destroying their family for his own selfish gratification. She deserved to know the truth just as much as I had needed to know it. So I asked Ron to make additional copies of his investigation report, and I made a decision that would have consequences far beyond my own situation. I decided that Bob's wife deserved to know what her husband was doing. The timing of what happened next was carefully coordinated. On the same day that my wife was served divorce papers at her workplace, a public, professional humiliation that announced to her colleagues that her marriage was ending. Ron was meeting with Bob's wife to show her the complete evidence of her husband's affair. I want to be clear about something here. This wasn't about revenge, at least not primarily. It was about justice. It was about ensuring that all the victims of this deception had the information they needed to make informed decisions about their lives. Bob's wife had the right to know that her marriage was a sham, just as I had needed to know the same thing. But sometimes justice and revenge intersect in ways that are more satisfying than you could ever plan. While my own divorce proceedings were relatively straightforward, infidelity might not legally matter in no-fault divorce states, but having documentation certainly helps with negotiations. Bob's life began to unravel in spectacular fashion. According to the publicly available court documents that I may have followed with great interest, Bob's wife didn't just file for divorce. She went nuclear. The very day she learned about the affair, she cleaned out their joint bank accounts, took their 3 children, and left their home. But that was just the beginning. Remember how I mentioned that Bob worked for his father-in-law's company? Well, it turns out that when your daughter's marriage falls apart because her husband is cheating, and you're also that cheating husband's boss, employment decisions become very personal. Bob was fired immediately upon his father-in-law learning about the affair. But it gets better, or worse depending on your perspective. The house where Bob and his family had been living? It wasn't theirs. It belonged to his wife's parents. So not only did Bob lose his job when his affair was discovered, he also got evicted from his home. In the span of a single day, he went from having a wife, children, job, and home to having none of those things. The divorce proceedings that followed were absolutely brutal. Bob's wife had excellent legal representation, probably paid for by her family, and she was out for blood. The court documents reveal a pattern of increasingly desperate behavior from Bob as he watched his life completely disintegrate. Apparently, Bob made the mistake of going to the family home to try to argue with his estranged wife, possibly to beg for forgiveness or to demand access to his children. But his wife's family wasn't having any of it. When the argument escalated, his brother-in-law intervened physically, and Bob ended up with a broken nose. That altercation led to restraining orders, which Bob violated multiple times, leading to additional police reports, criminal charges, and jail time. It was like watching someone dig their own grave deeper with every desperate attempt to climb out of it. The last credible information I could find about Bob suggested that he had left the state entirely, probably trying to escape the wreckage of his former life and start over somewhere else where people didn't know the story of how his selfish choices had destroyed 2 families. Meanwhile, Bob's ex-wife landed on her feet quite nicely. She went to work for her father's company, eventually taking over the business when he retired. She had the support of her family, financial security, and the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. As for my own situation, the divorce from my wife was surprisingly amicable, all things considered. I didn't engage with her on any topic that wasn't directly related to our children's well-being. I wasn't interested in drama, arguments, or emotional confrontations. I just wanted to move forward with my life and ensure that our kids suffered as little as possible from their parents' failed marriage. Now that my children are adults, I have no contact with my ex-wife at all. I don't hate her. Hate requires too much emotional energy and gives someone more power over your life than they deserve. I simply don't think about her unless it's necessary for some reason related to our children. The lesson in all of this isn't about revenge, though I won't lie and say there wasn't satisfaction in watching Bob's life fall apart as a consequence of his choices. The real lesson is about the importance of truth, the value of methodical investigation over emotional reaction, and the understanding that actions have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate participants. Bob thought he could have an affair without destroying his life because affairs happen in secret, hidden from the people who would be hurt by them. He never considered that someone like me might decide that his wife deserved to know the truth. He never imagined that his selfish gratification could lead to losing everything that mattered in his life. My wife thought she could maintain her double life indefinitely, using our children as alibis while she pursued her high school fantasy. She never considered that her husband might be observant enough to notice discrepancies, methodical enough to gather evidence, and decisive enough to act on what he discovered. Both of them learned that betrayal has a cost, and sometimes that cost is higher than anyone imagines when they make the decision to cheat. The most satisfying part of this entire story isn't the revenge, though. It's the knowledge that I handled the situation with integrity. I could have confronted my wife emotionally, created drama, made our children's lives miserable with public arguments and accusations. Instead, I gathered facts, made informed decisions, and acted in a way that protected the people who mattered most: my children and Bob's wife. I could have let anger drive my choices, but anger makes you stupid, and stupid people make mistakes that they regret later. By staying calm, thinking strategically, and focusing on long-term consequences rather than short-term emotional satisfaction, I was able to end my marriage with dignity and ensure that justice was served to everyone who deserved it. The truth is that most people who cheat get away with it, at least in the sense that they don't face serious consequences for their betrayal. They might lose their marriages, but they often move on to new relationships, new lives, new opportunities to repeat the same patterns with different people. But sometimes, if you're methodical enough, patient enough, and strategic enough, you can ensure that betrayal comes with a price that makes people think twice about their choices. Sometimes you can make sure that the person who thought they were smart enough to cheat without consequences learns exactly how wrong they were. Bob learned that lesson the hard way. He lost his wife, his children, his job, his home, and his reputation, all because he thought he could have an affair without destroying his life. He was wrong, and his wrongness cost him everything. My ex-wife learned that her husband wasn't the naive, trusting fool she thought she was married to. She learned that betrayal comes with consequences, even when you think you're being clever about hiding it. And I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just making sure that everyone involved knows the truth and can make their own decisions about what to do with that information. The truth has a way of working itself out, especially when you help it along with a little strategic thinking and professional investigation. Bob's wife deserved to know what her husband was doing, just like I deserved to know what my wife was doing. By ensuring that the truth came out, I didn't just protect myself, I protected her too. That's the real satisfaction in this story. Not that Bob's life was destroyed, though I won't pretend I wasn't pleased by that outcome. The real satisfaction is knowing that I handled an impossible situation with integrity, protected the innocent parties involved, and ensured that the people who chose betrayal faced appropriate consequences for their choices. In the end, karma didn't destroy Bob's life. Information did. Truth did. The simple decision to make sure that everyone affected by his choices knew what he was doing. That's what brought his world crashing down around him, and sometimes that's exactly what justice looks like.